Well, are you ready then? We've had part 1 and part 2. And now we're on to chapter 14. She's my sister. Suddenly there was a scream for the house, and Wendy came running down the path, shouting at the policeman to let her sister go. The policeman looked a bit puzzled. And when Wendy's mother, mummy and daddy, and she was always going to call them now, told him it would be all right to leave Mary, he got into his car and drove away. Wendy took hold of Mary's hand, walked into the house and said, "Mummy and Daddy, I want you to meet my new sister and your new daughter, Mary." The next few hours were all questions: where she'd been, what had happened, how she'd lived, and how she'd come now that she had a sister. Wendy explained to all of them what had happened, just as it was in the story we have read. All the time she and Mary sat together, still in their dirty, smelly clothes, holding each other's hand, of course cuddling Susan. Wendy's mummy did not worry about them being dirty. She was so happy that their daughter had come home. She told them how they tried to find her, how they had become nasty and bitter people because they had lost her. She told Wendy that it was only after she'd been missing her that she realised they'd not been very good parents to her, and would get everything to find her and tell her that they really loved her. Mary started to yawn and said would they mind if she slept, as they had not slept very well these last few days. Wendy's mother said they must first go upstairs and have a bath, and get changed in some clean clothes, and come back down for something to eat. Mary had never in her whole life had a bath. Sounded such fun. So Wendy and her, still holding hands, climbed the stairs and had a bath. I'm sure you can imagine just what fun they had in the bath. How they giggled and laughed. The floor was wet and the bath was full of bubbles. But at last they got out and went into Wendy's bedroom. Mummy had put on the bed some clean night dresses for them, and once dressed went downstairs again. Mary kept looking at her night dress. She had never worn one before, always sleeping in the same clothes she wore during the day. It was also the cleanest clothes she'd ever put on. They ate the food that Mummy had cooked for them, the first food they'd had for many days, and the first meal that Wendy had ever sat at a table and eaten. Oh, this was all going to be first. Time for bed, and Wendy's mummy started to show Mary into the guest bedroom. Wendy said, "Mummy, Mary and I always sleep in the same bed, and we cuddle Susan between us. Sometimes Mary tells me a story all about the fun and games Susan gets up to, so can she please sleep with me?" Her mummy replied, "Of course she can," and calling down to her husband asked him to bring up Susan. Soon they were all tucked into bed. Mary had never slept in a bed before, or in a bedroom. Wendy's mother bent down and gave them both a kiss, as did her daddy. And a short space of a wink of an eye, they were both asleep. Chapter 15. The next few days. They both awake with the sun shining through their bedroom window. There between them lay Susan. This was the first chance Mary had time to look around. It was everything like a fairy story. The rest of the day was filled with new things to do, to see, to touch and to feel. It was like being born all over again. She looked at herself in the hall mirror. She'd never been this clean. Her hair was shiny from washing it with shampoo. Her clothes she had on were very smart and smelt nice. It was there that Wendy's mummy found her, standing in front of the mirror, crying. She put her arms around her and held her very, very tight. "Wendy has told us all about how you saved her, and looked after her, and how she loves you like a sister, and we'd love you to stay with us. To tell you the truth, I always wanted another daughter, and now I have one." She started to cry as well. Everything also seemed so strange to Wendy as well. The house was the same. Her bedroom was just as she left it, but there was a big difference. That first morning, she heard Daddy phoning into the office to tell them he would not be coming in for the next week or so. He told them his daughter and her sister had arrived home, and he had so much catching up to do that he would have no time for work. Oh, he'd never done that before. It was a good job, and he was somebody important at work. They might have sacked him, thought Wendy. If she asked him a question, whatever he was doing, he stopped and smiled at her, and spent time answering the question. He'd never done that before. He took them both out shopping. Huh, never done that before. He played with them in the garden. Huh, never done that before. He was a real daddy. He'd never done that before. He also seemed to have a great big grin on his face all the time. Never done that before. Mummy always seemed to have time for them now. She cooked the meals. She'd never done that before. Always going out to takeaways. She sang to herself while she was cooking. She'd never done that before. She did not shout out to her, but called gently to her. She'd never done that before. Whenever she came into the room, she always had a smile on her face and a glassy look in her eye, like a tear. She'd never done that before. She was like a real mummy. She'd never done that before. Both her mummy and daddy would often be seen holding hands. They'd never done that before. They would smile and giggle at each other. They'd never done that before. They even saw them kissing each other. Oh, they'd never done that before. Yes, Wendy was back home, and her new sister was with her. Chapter 16. The Visits. About a week had gone by, and everything was wonderful. Mary had never eaten so much food, and even started to put a little bit of weight on, as had Wendy. They had told Mum and Daddy all about working and collecting plastic bottles and where they lived, and on this Monday morning asked if they could show them their tented home. At first they were not too sure, but after talking about it between themselves, they agreed, and they all climbed into the car and off they went. It only took them 30 minutes in the car to drive across Calcutta, not the 3 days it had taken to walk. Sorry. They therefore soon arrived at the roadway, and there under the ramp was their little tented home. The two girls got out of the car that day and went inside the home. On the outside, the girls were different to those who had left it, but inside they relived all the happy and sad times they shared under that roadway. Mummy and Daddy came in as well. Oh, and both burst out crying when they saw and realised just how the two of them had been living these last 6 months. No wonder nobody could find them. Mary sat back down on the bed, her own mother's bed, and started to tell them all about how wonderful her mother was and how she had cared and loved her. She told them how she had died, and told them again how the doll fell into her lap. They all laughed at that. In some way that broke the sadness of Mary's heart. Her mother would be so happy for her now in her new life. They did not stay much longer and climbed back in the car to go visit somebody in the office. Mary and Wendy had no idea where they were going. They pulled up outside a large office building, and a doorman opened the door for the girls. Oh, that was another first for Mary. She and Wendy smiled at the doorman, and they said thank you to him. That was the first time Wendy had ever said thank you to the doorman. They entered the building and were shown into a very large office, and sitting at his desk was a kind-looking man. He got up from his desk and walked over and shook hands with them all. "So these are your two daughters," he said with a smile on his face. What Wendy's parents had done was to ask this very clever lawyer to find out if there was any reason why they should not adopt Mary as their lawful daughter. The lawyer had spoken to the police, and they had traced the fact that Mary's real mother had died just before Christmas. They had also found out her father had been killed many years before, and that there was no other living person who Mary could go and live with. He explained he had placed adverts in the paper, which was the law, asking for anybody to come forward who might have any claim on Mary, but nobody had. Papers had been taken to court, and the judge had agreed that Mary could be adopted and would therefore become the legal daughter, of course, of Wendy's sister. All that took place was for Mary to agree for her new mummy and daddy to sign the papers. Mary could not believe it. She was going to be able to live with a new sister forever. Oh, Wendy and she hugged each other, and the tears that ran down their faces no longer washed away the dirt and grime of the street. Wendy's mother looked at Mary and said, "So, my darling, would you like to be my daughter?" But before you answer that question, and reaching into her bag, she pulled out Susan. "You do understand. You've become her daughter. We also want to adopt Susan into our family as well." She handed Susan to Mary and Wendy, and they all stood up. The lawyer turned to Mary, asked her what she wanted to do. Did she want to be part of this loving family? And she replied with a smile, "Yes, I do. Thank you." That was it, and it was done. They all signed the paper. Mary put a cross, as she could not write her name, and she was part of the family. Chapter 17. What happened next? Well, all this took place some 20 years ago. The girls are now both grown up. After all, they're both 26 years old. Their lives and that of their mummy and daddy changed as well. To start with, both girls got married. Yes, you guessed it, both on the same day. Well, you see, Wendy and Mary did everything together. They even both now have 2 children of their own. Mary has 2 boys, and Wendy has 2 girls. But let's just go back and see how things changed for them now. Daddy used his high-powered job to raise money for the poor people living on the streets in Calcutta. He had schools built and training centres where boys and girls could learn a trade and not have to beg on the streets. Mummy worked with many other mothers and children, helping them look after their families. She never went to posh parties now, unless it was to raise money. The only party she went to was when a new baby was born to the families that she worked with. The 2 girls went to school together. They sat next to each other in the classroom, studied together and left school with very high exam results. Together with their mummy and daddy, and even after all this time they still called them that, they started a charity to help and support street children, not only in Calcutta but in towns and villages around the area. Oh, they have a large office, paid for by Daddy's company. And in this office not only do they work, but they also hold meetings and train other people to carry on the tasks in the streets. In one corner of this office is a small tented home, the one they all lived in all those years ago underneath the roadway. They went back soon after Mary was adopted and dismantled it and kept it so that one day, should they ever forget, it would remind them just how some children live in Calcutta. Oh yes. I should also tell you that their desks are next to each other. On the left sits and works Mary, and on the right sits and works Wendy. Sitting right in the middle of the 2 desks, dressed in a pale, dirty pink dress, sits Susan.